He was a warrior born of the canyons and the unforgiving sun, a man whose silence spoke louder than any threat. She was the town's ghost, a creature of shadow and whispers, her face a roadmap of tragedy that made children cry and grown men look away. When Callan of the Stone Crows chose the disfigured Maeve O'Connell as his bride, the town of Redemption Gulch erupted in cruel laughter. They called him a fool, a savage, blinded by some strange honor. They mocked her pityingly, this broken thing being shackled to a wild man. But they didn't know the secrets hidden behind a scarred face, or the real price of the bargain struck in the heart of the West. They saw a pathetic union. They had no idea they were witnessing the birth of a legend. The sun over Redemption Gulch was a merciless hammer. It beat the dust of the main street into a fine, choking powder. It clung to everything. The sweat-stained hats of the lounging cowboys, the thirsty wooden beams of the saloon, and the stoic, unmoving figure of Callan. He stood before the land office, a man apart, carved from the red rock and shadow of the lands that lay beyond the town's petty concerns. His black hair, long and straight, was held back by a simple leather band. His features were sharp, his eyes the color of dark, polished obsidian, and they missed nothing. He was here not as a warrior, but as a diplomat, a role he wore as comfortably as a shroud. His people, the Stone Crows, were being squeezed. The long drought had withered the streams that fed their ancestral lands, and the one river that still flowed strong, the Serpent's Tooth, was being systematically diverted by the vast cattle empire of Bartholomew Bart Corbin. Corbin was Redemption Gulch. He owned the bank, the sheriff, and the fear in most men's hearts. He was a man of expansive appetites and zero compassion, his face a fleshy testament to his own success, his eyes small and greedy. The meeting had been a farce of civility. Corbin, flanked by the pot-bellied Sheriff Brody, had laid out his terms with a smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Water is a commodity, Callan," Corbin had said, leaning back in his leather chair, the wood groaning under his bulk. "And my cattle need to drink. Your people can pray for rain, or you can make a deal." The deal was poison wrapped in parchment. Corbin would grant the Stone Crows limited water rights, enough to survive but not to thrive. In exchange, Callan's people would cede the eastern grazing lands, a sacred place to them, a place where their ancestors were buried. It was an impossible choice. But then Corbin added a peculiar, cruel flourish, a personal condition. "To show good faith," Corbin had purred, a glint of malice in his eyes, "to prove you're willing to truly integrate, to become a part of our world, you will take a wife from this town." Callan's jaw had tightened, but his expression remained a mask of stone. He knew this was not an offer of integration. It was a test of humiliation. "And I have just the woman in mind," Corbin continued, his smile widening. "Maeve O'Connell. Marry her, and the water is yours. The town will bear witness. A public ceremony, a true joining of our communities." The name fell into the tense silence of the room like a stone into a shallow grave. Maeve O'Connell, the town pariah, the scarred girl. Callan had seen her, a fleeting glimpse of a hunched figure hurrying from the general store, a burlap sack clutched tight, her face turned away. But he had heard the whispers, the cruel jests that followed in her wake. "Cougar face," the children would taunt. "Old Man O'Connell's ruined daughter," the men would mumble into their whiskey. Sheriff Brody had snorted, a wet, dismissive sound. "He won't do it, Bart. Even he has his pride." Corbin's gaze never left Callan. It was a challenge, a public emasculation designed to break him before his people. To accept was to swallow an insult that would be told around campfires for generations. To refuse was to condemn his tribe to thirst and starvation. Callan's voice, when it came, was low and steady, like the rumble of distant thunder. "The agreement will be put to paper. The water rights will be guaranteed by federal charter, not by your word. The wedding will take place in 1 week. My people will have their water before the ceremony." Corbin's face registered a flicker of surprise, quickly replaced by smug satisfaction. He had expected a fight, a proud refusal. This easy capitulation was even sweeter. He saw it as proof of the warrior's desperation, the final breaking of the Stone Crow's will. As Kalen walked out of the land office and back into the oppressive heat, the news had already begun to slither through the town like a snake in the dust. The mockery started almost immediately. Hear that? The savage is taking Scarface Maeve. Ian, one cowboy, guffawed from the porch of the saloon. Must be blind, another called out. Or maybe his kind likes their women pre-chewed by a cat. A wave of ugly laughter followed him down the street. Kalen's hands did not clench into fists. His stride did not falter. He absorbed the insults like the dry earth absorbed a light rain, showing no effect on the surface. Inside, however, a cold fire was kindling. He was doing this for his people. He was their shield, and a shield must endure the blows without shattering. He stopped at the blacksmith's, his gaze falling upon the subject of his forced bargain. Maeve O'Connell was there, collecting a mended iron pot. She was thin, almost frail, dressed in a faded calico dress that hung loosely on her frame. Her hair was a nondescript brown, pulled back in a severe bun. And then there was her face. The left side was a ruin. A series of deep, puckered scars ran from her temple down across her cheek, pulling at the corner of her eye and the edge of her mouth, giving her a permanent, lopsided grimace. It was a shocking disfigurement, and she seemed to carry its weight in every line of her body. Her shoulders were hunched, her eyes fixed on the ground, as if she was perpetually apologizing for her own existence. She felt his stare. Her head jerked up, and for a single breathtaking moment, their eyes met. He expected to see fear or shame or despair. He saw all of those things. But beneath them, in the depths of her one good eye, a startlingly clear shade of green, he saw something else. A flicker of something hard and sharp, like a shard of flint buried in soft clay. It was there and gone in an instant, replaced by a cowed subservience as she snatched the pot and scurried away, never looking back. The blacksmith, a burly man named Gus, shook his head with a pitying sigh. Poor girl. Never had a chance after that cat got her. And now this, tying her to you. No offense, but Corbin's a devil for even thinking it up. Kalen offered no reply. He merely watched Maeve's retreating form until she disappeared into the small, dilapidated shack at the edge of town that had been her home since her prospector father died years ago. He had made a bargain to save his people. He had accepted a wife, sight unseen, a woman universally reviled. He had endured the town's scorn. He was prepared for a life tethered to a broken, silent woman. He believed he understood the full cost of the sacrifice he was making. He was wrong. The true cost and the unexpected prize were secrets yet to be revealed, hidden behind a wall of scarred flesh and a conspiracy of silence. Maeve O'Connell's world was a small, suffocating space. It was defined by 4 crumbling walls and the averted gazes of the people of Redemption Gulch. Her life was a litany of hushed insults and feigned invisibility. She moved through the town like a phantom, her presence acknowledged only by the sudden silences or the poorly disguised jeers that followed her. The scars were her cage. She remembered the day they were born in flashes of screaming terror. The weight of the beast, the hot slash of claws, the smell of blood and pine needles. A mountain lion, they said. It had killed her father, Patrick, on that prospecting trip and had left her marked for life. She had been just a girl. Doc Hemlock had stitched her up as best he could, but medicine in a town like this was a thing of whiskey and crude thread. The wounds healed, but they left behind a mass she could never remove. Over the years, the physical pain had faded, replaced by the dull, constant ache of ostracism. She learned to make herself small, to hunch her shoulders and keep her eyes on the dusty ground. She spoke only when necessary, her voice a low, hesitant murmur. This meekness became her armor. If they saw her as a pathetic creature, they would eventually tire of tormenting her and simply leave her be. Pity, she had learned, was a safer shield than defiance. When Sheriff Brody had come knocking on her door, his shadow falling dark across her threshold, she had expected an eviction notice or some other town-sanctioned misery. She did not expect a marriage proposal. Bartholomew Corbin has made an arrangement, Brody said, not bothering to meet her eye, instead focusing on a crack in her wooden floor. For the good of the town, there's a treaty with the Stone Crows. You're to marry their leader, Kalen. Maeve felt the blood drain from her face, It was a joke. It had to be a cruel, elaborate joke. She looked past Brodie and saw the smirking faces of two of Corbin's ranch hands leaning against a nearby fence. This wasn't a proposal. It was a public sentencing. I, I don't understand, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You don't need to understand, Brodie grunted impatiently. You just need to be at the church on Sunday. Corbin's being generous. He's even paying off your father's debts at the general store. You should be grateful. Grateful. The word was a slap. She was being sold like livestock, a piece in Bart Corbin's cruel game against the native people, and she was expected to be grateful. Her silence was taken as assent. Brodie tipped his hat with mocking formality and left, the laughter of the ranch hands following him down the path. The days leading up to the wedding were a special kind of hell. The whispers grew louder, bolder. Women would stop talking when she entered the store, turning their backs with theatrical disgust. Men made loud, lewd comments about what a savage's wedding night with a ruined bride must be like. She was no longer just an object of pity. She was a spectacle, a freak in Corbin's circus. She saw her future husband only once more before the ceremony, from a distance. He was bartering for supplies, his movements economical and precise. He carried himself with a quiet dignity that seemed impenetrable to the town's scorn. He was an outsider, just like her. But where she was bent and broken by her isolation, he seemed forged by it, hard and unyielding as the mountains he came from. She felt a strange, unwelcome flicker of connection to him, a shared experience of being judged and found wanting by the cruel standards of this town. It was a foolish, dangerous thought, and she crushed it immediately. He was her jailer, another man who would control her life, another pair of eyes that would flinch when they looked upon her face. The night before the wedding, Maeve sat alone in her shack, the moonlight painting silver stripes across the rough-hewn floor. She didn't cry. Tears felt like a luxury she had lost the right to long ago. Instead, she opened a loose floorboard beneath her cot. From the dark space, she retrieved a small leather-bound journal and a rolled-up bundle of oilskins. The journal was her father's. His neat, precise handwriting filled the pages. He wasn't just a prospector. He was a geologist, a man of science in a world of superstition. He wrote of strata and quartz veins, of hydrostatic pressure and mineral deposits. And on the last few pages, he wrote of his great discovery, a vein of silver so rich it would rival the Comstock lode, nestled deep within the Serpent's Tooth Canyon system, on land currently occupied by the Stone Crows, the very land Corbin was trying to steal. Her father hadn't been killed by a mountain lion. The memory was sharper than the scars on her face. It was the smell of Corbin's cheap cigar, the glint of a rifle barrel in the moonlight. Two of Corbin's men, Roscoe and a man long gone, had cornered them at their camp. They wanted the maps, the location of the silver. Her father had refused. There was a struggle, a gunshot, and then to cover their crime, they had unleashed their own form of savagery. Roscoe had held her down, his grimy hand over her mouth, while the other man took a skinning knife. It wasn't a cougar. It was a man. The town accepted the story because it was easy and because Bart Corbin told them to. A wild animal was a random act of God. Murder was a complication. She unrolled the oilskins. Inside was a masterfully drawn map, a duplicate of the one her father had died for. For years she had guarded this secret. For years she had played the role of the meek, terrified victim, knowing that if Corbin ever suspected she knew the truth, she would end up in a shallow grave just like her father. Her ugliness had been her shield, her meekness, her camouflage. It made her invisible, unworthy of a second thought. Now Corbin himself was delivering her into the hands of the one man who had a reason to fight him, the one man whose people owned the land on that map. It was an irony so bitter it almost made her laugh. Corbin, in his arrogance, thought he was delivering Kalen a broken toy. He had no idea he was handing his greatest enemy the key to his destruction. A new feeling began to displace the fear in Maeve's heart, a cold, hard resolve. She had been a victim for long enough. This marriage was not a sentence. It was an opportunity. She would be shackled to a stranger, a man the town called a savage. But perhaps this savage was the only one who could help her claim her father's legacy and bring his killers to justice. She ran a finger over the deep scar on her cheek. It had been her prison for a decade. Perhaps, just perhaps, it was about to become her weapon. The wedding day dawned gray and blustery, the sky a bruised purple that mirrored the mood of the unwilling bride in the scornful town. The ceremony was held in the small, sun-bleached church at the center of Redemption Gulch, not for reasons of piety, but for public display. Bartholomew Corbin wanted witnesses to his triumph, to the taming of the wild man. Maeve was dressed in a simple gray dress, the best she owned. No one had offered her a white one. She walked to the church alone, a slow, deliberate march through a gauntlet of staring eyes and venomous whispers. She kept her gaze down, her shoulders hunched in the familiar posture of shame. She played her part to perfection. Kalen was already waiting inside. He stood not at the altar but near the door, as if ready to bolt. He wore beaded leather leggings and a simple linen shirt, his bearing a stark contrast to the suited, smirking form of Bart Corbin in the front pew. As Maeve entered, a hush fell over the assembled crowd, quickly followed by a ripple of snickers and murmurs. The preacher, a nervous man named Reverend Michael who owed Corbin a substantial debt, rushed through the service. His words were hollow, devoid of any sentiment. When he reached the part about, "Speak now or forever hold your peace," Corbin let out a loud, theatrical cough that set off a fresh wave of muffled laughter. Kalen's face remained an unreadable mask of granite. He did not look at his bride. Maeve kept her face turned, so the scarred side was most visible to the congregation. A silent, defiant gesture they mistook for shame. When the preacher declared them man and wife, there was no kiss. There was only a heavy, awkward silence, broken by Corbin's booming voice. "A toast to the happy couple," he bellowed, rising from his seat. "A true union of civilization and the wild. May it be fruitful." The saloon-ready crowd roared with laughter at the cruel double meaning. The walk from the church to Kalen's temporary lodging, a small cabin on the outskirts of town designated for Indian business, was the longest of Maeve's life. They walked a few feet apart, a chasm of silence and misunderstanding between them, the town's mockery following them like a pack of coyotes. The cabin was sparse, a single room with a hard-packed dirt floor, a small stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, two chairs, and a narrow bed covered with a wool blanket. The air was thick with tension. This was it, the wedding night, the final act of her humiliation. Kalen moved to the fireplace and began to build a fire, his back to her. He hadn't spoken a single word to her. He probably found her as repulsive as everyone else. He was likely planning to sleep by the fire, to put as much distance as possible between them. Maeve watched him for a long moment. Then she took a breath, the air rattling in her lungs. The performance was over. She walked to the heavy wooden door and slid the iron bolt firmly into place. The sound was loud in the small cabin, a definitive thunk that broke the silence. Kalen turned, his hand hovering over a piece of kindling. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw her straighten her back. The pathetic hunch she had carried for years melted away, replaced by a posture of confident stillness. She lifted her chin, her eyes no longer downcast but meeting his directly. "They think you are a fool," she said. Her voice was not the timid whisper he had heard before. It was clear, steady, and held a surprising low timbre. "They think you have been burdened with a broken, useless wife." Kalen remained silent, his obsidian eyes watchful, taking in this sudden, startling transformation. Maeve walked to the small wash basin in the corner. She poured water from a pitcher and, taking a rough cloth, began to scrub at her face. Not just her clean side, but the scarred side. She rubbed with a firm, practiced motion. Grime and what looked like ash came away, revealing that while the scars were real and severe, their appearance had been deliberately exaggerated. The shadows she painted into the crevices to make them seem deeper, the dullness she added to her skin to make it look sallow. It all washed away. The underlying skin, though tragically mapped with old wounds, was clean and pale. The disfigurement was still shocking, but it was no longer grotesque. It was simply a part of her. She turned back to him, dabbing her face dry. "My name is Maeve O'Connell. My father was Patrick O'Connell, and he was murdered by Bartholomew Corbin. The statement hung in the air, more shocking than her changed appearance. Kalen's expression didn't change, but a new light flickered in his eyes. He slowly lowered the kindling and gave her his full, undivided attention. "They told you he was killed by a mountain lion," she continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "That was a lie Corbin invented to hide his crime. My father was a geologist. He found something in the Serpent's Tooth canyons, something Corbin wanted." She moved to the small, worn traveling sack she'd brought with her. From it, she removed the oilskin bundle. She walked to the table, her movements now fluid and graceful, and unrolled it. Upon the table, illuminated by the flickering lamplight, lay a map. It was a thing of beauty and precision, drawn with an expert hand. It detailed a section of the canyons with geological notations, elevation markings, and symbols Kalen had never seen before. One area was marked with a bold red X. "This is a map to the richest silver vein this side of the territories," Maeve said, her voice dropping to a low, intense pitch. "It's on your people's land. That is what Corbin is after. Not grass, not water. He wants the mountain itself. He killed my father for this map, but my father was clever. He made a duplicate. I have kept it hidden all these years." She finally looked up and met Kalen's gaze, her one good eye burning with a fire that seemed hot enough to forge steel. "Corbin thinks he handed you a scarred, stupid girl to humiliate you. He's wrong. He handed you the weapon that will destroy him. I am not your burden, Kalen of the Stone Crows. I am your vengeance." In the silence of the cabin, with the town's mocking laughter a distant memory, Kalen looked from the determined, intelligent face of the woman before him to the map that promised either salvation or ruin. He had made a bargain to save his people from dying of thirst. He was beginning to realize he had been given the means to give them a kingdom. The wedding night was not an end. It was the unveiling of a secret war. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting long, dancing shadows across the cabin walls. The world outside, with its assumptions and its cruelty, ceased to exist. Inside, a new reality was being forged between two outsiders. Kalen pulled one of the two chairs up to the table and sat, his eyes fixed on the map. He gestured for Maeve to take the other. For the first time, they were not a spectacle, but equals. "Tell me everything," Kalen said, his voice a low command. It was not a demand born of dominance, but of necessity. Maeve began to speak, and the story of her life, the real story, poured out. She spoke of her father not as a desperate prospector, but as a brilliant, self-taught academic. He had corresponded with geologists in Boston and London, trading knowledge for books and equipment. He had come west not just for gold, but for knowledge, to map the untold story of the rocks. He wasn't looking for a quick strike, she explained, her finger tracing a river on the map. He was patient. He taught me to read the land, to see the history in the layers of stone. He said, "The earth keeps its secrets, but it gives clues to those who know the language." She had been his apprentice. While other girls were learning to sew and cook, she was learning to identify igneous rock, to use a sextant, to draw topographical lines. The map on the table was as much her work as his. "We found it 6 months before he died," she said, her voice catching for a moment before hardening again. "A fissure hidden behind a waterfall that only runs in the spring melt. It leads to a network of caves. The walls are laced with native silver, not just a vein, a whole system, enough to make kings of men." She then recounted the night of the murder in stark, unflinching detail. The ambush by Roscoe, Corbin's brutish foreman, and another man. Her father's refusal to give up the map, the gunshot that echoed in the canyon, and the horrific, calculated cruelty that followed. "The scars," she said, her hand unconsciously rising to her cheek. "They were a message, to terrorize a child into silence. Roscoe held me down. He told me that if I ever spoke of what I saw, he'd come back and finish the job. He said everyone loves a tragedy, and that the story of a cougar attack would be much more believable than the ramblings of a hysterical orphan girl." Kalen listened without interruption. His stillness was absolute, but Maeve could see a muscle tightening along his jaw. He was a man accustomed to violence, but the calculated cruelty against a child struck a deeper, colder chord. Corbin has been searching for the mine ever since, Maeve continued. He sends his own men into the canyons, but they know nothing. They're just cowboys looking for a hole in the ground. They don't know how to read the rocks. They don't have the key. She tapped the map. And all this time I've been right here, under his nose. The broken, ugly girl nobody looks at twice. The perfect place to hide. She retrieved her father's journal and pushed it across the table. He documented everything, his findings, his calculations, and his suspicions about Corbin. He knew Corbin was watching him. Kalen opened the journal. The handwriting was precise, the drawings detailed. Though he couldn't understand all the scientific terms, he understood the language of maps and land. He saw sketches of rock formations he recognized, notes about water tables, and finally the detailed entry about the silver discovery. It was proof, tangible, damning proof. But something about it felt off. He pointed to a small symbol drawn next to the X marking the mine's entrance. "What is this?" Maeve leaned closer. "I don't know. I always assumed it was one of my father's geological symbols, one he hadn't taught me yet." Kalen stared at the symbol. It wasn't a geological sign. It was a pictograph of his own people, an ancient one. It meant trap. The map her father died to protect, the map she had guarded for a decade, was leading them to a trap. Kalen looked from the map to Maeve. Her eyes were shining with the hope of justice, a hope he was about to complicate. This was a new twist. Corbin wasn't just blindly searching. He knew something. And her father had known he knew. "Why me?" Kalen finally asked, his voice quiet, masking the sudden shift in his understanding. "Why reveal this to me now?" "Who else?" Maeve countered, a bitter smile touching her unscarred lip. "The law? Sheriff Brawdy is Corbin's dog on a leash. The townspeople? They either fear Corbin or profit from him. They threw me away years ago. You. You are the only one he can't buy. You are the only one with as much to lose, and as much to gain, as I have. This land is yours. My father respected your people. He wrote in his journal that the stone crows were the true guardians of the mountains, and that any wealth found should be shared." A long silence settled between them. He had entered this cabin yoked to a victim. He was now sitting with a strategist who had been playing a long, dangerous game of her own. The meek, hunched creature from the town was a fiction. The real Maeve O'Connell was sharp, brave, and burning with a righteous fury that matched his own cold anger. And she had no idea she was holding a loaded gun pointed right at her own head. He made a decision. He would not tell her about the symbol, not yet, not until he understood the nature of the trap. He finally closed the journal and pushed it gently back towards her. "My people have a saying," he said, his voice quiet. "The deepest roots grow in the hardest ground. You have been growing in hard ground for a long time, Maeve O'Connell." He stood and walked to the cabin's single window, peering out into the darkness. "Corbin thinks he has won. He has his land treaty, he has his water, and he believes he has broken our spirit with this marriage. He will grow careless." He turned back to her, and for the first time she saw something other than stoicism in his eyes. It was a glimmer of respect, of partnership. "We will not move against him directly. Not yet. First we confirm what is on this map. Then we use his own greed to destroy him." Maeve felt a profound sense of relief, so powerful it almost made her dizzy. For a decade she had carried this secret alone. Now she had an ally. "He will not expect us to work together," she said. "He expects you to ignore me or to treat me with contempt. We will use that." "Yes," Kalen agreed. "To the town you are my shame, and I am your keeper. Let them believe it. In the shadows we will become his ruin." The alliance was sealed. A man fighting for his people's future, and a woman fighting to reclaim her father's past. Their marriage, conceived as an act of mockery, had just become the most dangerous conspiracy in Redemption Gulch. And beneath it all lay another secret, a warning from a dead man that only one of them could read. The week that followed the wedding was a masterclass in deception. To the prying eyes of Redemption Gulch, the union between Kalen and Maeve was exactly the disaster everyone had predicted. Kalen was a ghost, appearing in town for supplies only when necessary, his face a mask of cold indifference. Maeve, when seen at all, was the same hunched, scurrying creature she had always been, her eyes perpetually fixed on the ground. When they were forced to appear together, a chasm of empty space separated them. The town's gossip mills churned with satisfaction. The proud warrior was clearly shamed by his scarred wife, and she was terrified of her savage husband. Corbin was immensely pleased. The humiliation was complete. But inside the small cabin, a different world existed. Evenings were spent poring over Patrick O'Connell's map and journal. Maeve would translate her father's geological shorthand, explaining the significance of fault lines and quartz intrusions, while Kalen would listen, correlating her words with his own intimate ancestral knowledge of the canyons. He never mentioned the symbol. Instead, he asked careful questions. Did your father speak of other paths, places of bad spirits? He mentioned alternate routes, Maeve recalled, tracing a secondary line on the map. He called this one the Echo Passage. He said it was treacherous, but a good shortcut. Why? No reason, Kalen said smoothly. A warrior must know all paths. A cautious respect grew between them. Kalen saw past her scars to the keen, analytical mind beneath. He admired her resilience, her decade-long vigil over her secret. Maeve in turn discovered that Kalen's silence was not a void, but a space of deep observation and thought. He spoke little, but his words held weight. He was honorable, and when he learned of her father's desire to share the mine's wealth with his people, his commitment to her cause became absolute. It was no longer just her vengeance. It was a fight for his tribe's destiny. Corbin, however, wasn't a man to leave things to chance. His arrogance was vast, but it was matched by his paranoia. A week after the wedding, he decided to test the strength of his new arrangement. He sent his foreman, Roscoe, into town. Roscoe was a big, brutish man with a face like a slab of raw meat and knuckles scarred from 100-bar fights. He was the man who had held Maeve down, the man whose face haunted her nightmares. She was at the general store, her back to the door, purchasing a small sack of flour, when his shadow fell over her. Well, well, look what we have here. Roscoe's voice was a low, gravelly sneer. Mrs. Savage, how's married life treating you? He learn you any new tricks? Maeve froze, her hand clenching the flour sack. The old instinctual fear washed over her, cold and sickening. She could feel the ghost of his grimy hand over her mouth, the sharp memory of the knife. For a second, her shoulders hunched and her head bowed. But then she thought of Kalen. She thought of the map, of the promise of justice. The fear was still there, but it was no longer her master. Slowly, she turned to face him. She did not cower. She did not look away. She met his gaze directly, her green eye as cold and hard as a winter river. My husband's affairs are none of your concern, Roscoe, she said. Her voice was quiet, but laced with ice. Roscoe was taken aback. He was used to her terrified silence. This calm defiance was new, and it angered him. He took a step closer, crowding her, his sheer bulk a form of intimidation. Getting mouthy, are we? Thinking because you're married to that redskin you've got some standing? Let me remind you what you are. He reached out his thick fingers, aiming for her scarred cheek. You're just... His wrist was caught in a grip of iron. Kalen had entered the store as silently as a hunting cat. He had been watching from across the street, anticipating this very move from Corbin. He stood beside Maeve now, his body a shield. His eyes, fixed on Roscoe, were not angry. They were worse. They were flat, black, and utterly devoid of emotion, like the eyes of a hawk studying its prey. Take your hand off my wife, Kalen said. The words were spoken softly, yet they cut through the store's dusty air like a razor. Roscoe tried to wrench his arm free, but Kalen's grip was unbreakable. A flicker of fear, quickly masked by bluster, crossed the foreman's face. I ain't doing nothing, just having a friendly conversation. The conversation is over, Kalen said, his grip tightening. Roscoe winced, his fingers going numb. You will not speak to her again. You will not look at her again. If you come near her again, I will finish what the mountain lion started. He said the words mountain lion with a slight, knowing emphasis that made the blood drain from Roscoe's face. Kalen released him with a shove that sent the bigger man stumbling backward into a barrel of pickles. The entire store had gone silent. Without another word, Kalen took the sack of flour from Maeve's hand, placed the coins on the counter, and gently guided her out of the store. The incident sent shock waves through the town. The story was told and retold in the saloon that night. The savage had defended his ugly wife. He had faced down Roscoe, Corbin's most feared enforcer, and made him back down like a whipped dog. It didn't make sense. When the news reached Bart Corbin, his smug satisfaction curdled into suspicion. This was not the behavior of a shamed, defeated man. It was the behavior of a man protecting something of value. For the first time, a sliver of doubt entered his mind. What if he had miscalculated? What if the scarred girl wasn't as broken as she seemed? The serpent, coiled comfortably in its nest of power, had been prodded, and now its head was beginning to rise. Corbin summoned Roscoe, his face a thundercloud. "Find out what's going on," he snarled. "Watch them. I want to know everywhere they go, everyone they talk to. I want to know what they say when they think no one is listening. Something isn't right about this. Find out what it is." The game had changed. The quiet war of secrets was about to become dangerously loud. The confrontation in the general store was a turning point. It had shattered their cover, but also solidified their bond. They both knew Corbin's suspicions would be aroused. The time for quiet planning was over. They had to act. "We need to go to the mine," Maeve said that evening, her voice tense. "We need to verify the entrance is still hidden, to get a sample of the ore. Proof that will stand up to any federal marshal we might be able to bring in from Prescott." Kalen nodded in agreement. His mind was on the symbol, the trap. Going to the mine was exactly what the enemy expected, which meant he had to control how they went. "Corbin will have us watched," he said. "His men will be expecting us to move." "Then we do what they don't expect," Maeve countered, a spark of her father's strategic mind lighting her eyes. "Corbin's men are cowboys, not trackers. They think of canyons as straight lines in and out. They don't know the high trails." She pointed to a section of the map far from the main canyon entrance. "My father and I used to camp here. There's a goat trail, barely wide enough for one person, that leads up the mesa wall. From the top, you can cut across and descend into the canyon system from above, right near the waterfall. They will be watching the mouth of the canyon, not the sky." It was a risky plan, requiring a treacherous climb and a long, exposed journey across the mesa. But it was their only chance to approach unseen. Or so she thought. Kalen saw the deeper advantage. The goat trail would bring them down near the waterfall, yes, near the main entrance marked with the trap symbol. But from the top of the mesa, they could also see the entire canyon system laid out before them. He could look for another way in, a way that corresponded with the echo passage Maeve had mentioned. He could bypass the trap entirely. They left 2 nights later under the sliver of a new moon. They moved not as a couple, but as two separate shadows, melting into the landscape Kalen knew so well. He led the way, his steps silent, his senses alert to the slightest sound. Maeve followed, her small frame surprisingly agile, her fear eclipsed by a steely determination. The climb up the goat trail was harrowing. Loose scree shifted under their feet, threatening to send them tumbling into the darkness below. But Maeve's memory of the path was exact, and Kalen's strength was a steadying presence. He would move ahead, secure a handhold, and guide her through the most difficult passages. In the shared danger and forced proximity, a new intimacy formed, an unspoken trust that went deeper than words. They reached the top of the mesa as the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky in the shades of rose and gray. The view was breathtaking, a vast panorama of cracked earth and shadowed canyons stretching to the horizon. But there was no time to admire it. They were exposed. They moved quickly across the flat top of the mesa, a harsh, windswept landscape of stunted juniper and sharp rock. By mid-morning, they found the descent point Maeve remembered, a steep, rugged ravine that cut back down into the heart of the Serpent's Tooth Canyon system. As they picked their way down, the echo of a sound reached them, faint but unmistakable, the whinny of a horse from the canyon floor below. Kalen froze, holding up a hand for Maeve to stop. They crouched behind a cluster of boulders, peering through a gap. Below them, perhaps half a mile away, were 3 riders. Roscoe was one of them. They were exactly where Maeve had predicted, guarding the main obvious entrance to the canyons. The entrance marked with the trap. "They're waiting for us," Maeve whispered, her heart pounding. "Let them wait," Kalen murmured back, his eyes scanning the terrain, not toward the riders, but in the opposite direction, towards a narrow slit in the far canyon wall. The Echo Passage. We go on. They reached the canyon floor a few hours later, far upstream from Corbin's men. The air grew cooler, the sound of running water a welcome murmur. Soon they saw it, a tall, thin waterfall cascading over a smooth rock face into a crystal-clear pool, just as Patrick O'Connell had described in his journal. "Behind there," Maeve said, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and grief. Kalen held up a hand. "Wait." He scanned the rocks around the waterfall, his eyes tracing the patterns of erosion, the placement of the boulders. Everything looked natural. Too natural. He pointed. "What is that?" At the base of the waterfall, half hidden by a fern, was a small carved stone. It looked like a trail marker, but when Maeve looked closer, her blood ran cold. It was a recent carving, not weathered like the rest of the rock. It was the O'Connell family crest, a small thing her father used to carve on his tools. Someone had put it there. Someone who knew her father. But her father was dead, which meant someone else was involved. Someone who knew about the mine. Someone who was playing a whole other game. And then another thought hit her, even more chilling. What if Corbin hadn't found the mine because he wasn't the only one looking for it? What if the real danger wasn't the man they knew, but the enemy they had never even seen? The small carved stone changed everything. It was a message, but from who? And what did it mean? "My father was a careful man," Maeve said, her mind racing. "He wouldn't mark the entrance like this. It's a signal, or a warning." Kalen agreed. His hand rested on the hilt of his knife. The trap he'd suspected was more complex than he'd imagined. It wasn't just Corbin's men waiting in ambush. There was another player on the board. "We don't go through the waterfall," Kalen said decisively. "We find another way, the Echo Passage." They backtracked, following the stream away from the beautiful, treacherous waterfall. The canyon narrowed, the walls closing in around them. Maeve's memory and her father's map led them to a dark, uninviting slit in the rock face, barely wide enough to walk through. This was the passage. It was a claustrophobic nightmare of twisting stone. At times they had to turn sideways to squeeze through. But Maeve knew every turn. Kalen, his warrior instincts on full alert, followed her lead, his knife in one hand, ready for an attack from the rear. After what felt like an eternity, they saw a sliver of light ahead. They burst out into a different part of the main canyon, gasping for air. They had bypassed Roscoe's men and the mysterious signal at the waterfall. According to the map, this passage should have opened up right behind the hidden mine entrance. They scrambled up a rockfall and peered over the edge. They saw the back of the waterfall, and what they saw made their hearts stop. The fissure, the crack in the mountain that led to the silver, was there, but it wasn't empty. A small, well-hidden camp was set up in the cavern behind the water. A bedroll, a small cook fire, and supplies. Someone was living here, and as they watched, a figure emerged from the tunnel leading to the mine. It wasn't Corbin, it wasn't Roscoe, it was Gus, the blacksmith, the friendly, pitying man from town. He carried a heavy sack that clinked with the sound of ore. He moved with a quiet efficiency, completely at home in this hidden place. The man who had warned Kalen about Corbin being a devil was secretly mining the silver for himself. He wasn't an ally, he was a thief, and he had been playing them all. Maeve felt a wave of betrayal so strong it almost made her sick. Gus had been her father's friend. He'd always treated her with a gruff kindness, a stark contrast to the rest of the town. She had trusted him. Now she realized his pity was a lie, a performance, just like her own meekness. Kalen watched Gus work, his expression hardening. The entire puzzle was reassembling itself in his mind. Gus knew the town. He knew Corbin's movements. He knew Kalen's deal. The carved stone at the waterfall, it wasn't a warning to them. It was a marker for himself, a way to find the entrance again quickly, and the trap symbol on the map. What if her father hadn't put it there to warn of Corbin? What if he put it there to warn of his friend, Gus? Before they could decide what to do, they heard a sharp whistle echo from down the canyon. A signal. Gus froze, his head snapping up. He quickly doused his fire, grabbed his rifle, and flattened himself against the rocks near the cave entrance, his eyes scanning the canyon. Roscoe and his men had found something. They were coming, but they weren't coming for Kalen and Maeve. They were coming for Gus. They weren't just in a canyon. They were in the middle of a war between two secret factions, and they were standing on the prize. The situation had just gone from dangerous to impossible. Roscoe and his two men urged their horses through the rocky creek bed, their voices echoing off the canyon walls. They hadn't seen Kalen and Maeve, but they were closing in on the waterfall. Gus, hidden in the shadows of the cave, raised his rifle, its barrel steady. Kalen and Maeve were trapped on the ledge above, caught between a thief and a murderer. "We have to move," Kalen whispered, his mind calculating their chances. Now, if a firefight started, their position on the exposed ledge would be a death trap. They slid back from the edge, their only escape route the way they came, back through the claustrophobic echo passage. It was their only hope. They scrambled back into the narrow slit in the rock just as the first gunshot cracked through the canyon. The war had begun. They plunged through the twisting stone, the sounds of the battle echoing behind them. Shouts, the thunder of rifles, the scream of a man hit. They burst out of the passage into the upper canyon, their lungs burning. They had escaped the crossfire, but they were far from safe. "He knew," Maeve said, leaning against the rock wall, trying to catch her breath. "Gus, he must have known all along. He was my father's friend. He probably helped him survey the canyon. My father trusted him." The betrayal was a fresh wound, deeper than any scar. "He used that trust," Kalen said, his eyes scanning the canyon rim. "He let Corbin do the dirty work, kill your father, and then he planned to take the silver for himself when the dust settled." A new terrible thought occurred to Maeve. The story about the mountain lion. Everyone believed it, but the details were so specific. The location, the time. What if Gus was the one who found me? What if he was the one who told the story to Sheriff Brody in the first place? He hadn't just been a silent partner. He had been the architect of the lie that had defined her entire life. He had caged her in shame and pity so he could steal her birthright. The fury that rose in her was cold and pure. Suddenly, a rifle shot cracked from the rim of the canyon above them. A puff of dust exploded near Maeve's feet. They had been seen, but it wasn't Roscoe's men. They were still fighting Gus down below. It was a fourth man, a sniper. Corbin had been more thorough than they'd thought. He had men on the rim as well. They were still caught in the crossfire. Without hesitation, Kalen shoved Maeve behind a thick pillar of rock and drew his own rifle. He didn't waste ammunition. He waited, his breathing slow and even, watching the canyon rim. He saw a glint of sunlight on a rifle barrel. He fired once. A cry of pain echoed down the canyon, and the glint disappeared. But the shot had given away their position. Down below, the fighting had momentarily stopped. A voice roared up from the canyon floor. It was Roscoe. "Up there! On the ridge! It's the Indian!" Now both sides knew where they were. Gus, Roscoe, and the remaining men would all be coming for them. They were pinned. As bullets from below began to chip away at their cover, Kalen looked at Maeve. Her face was smudged with dirt, her eyes wide with fear, but also with a fierce, unyielding resolve. In this crucible of dust and gunfire, they were no longer just allies. They were partners, their survival inextricably linked. Kalen knew they would either leave this canyon together or die here together, and he would not let them die. He began to scan the rock face, not for an escape route, but for a place to make their final stand. The pillar of rock that gave them shelter was their only shield. Gunfire from Roscoe's men downstream, and now presumably from Gus near the waterfall, pinned them in a deadly embrace. The sun bled out of the sky, and long purple shadows stretched across the canyon floor, offering fleeting cover, but also hiding the movements of their enemies. "They're trying to flank us," Kalen said, his voice a low growl. He had seen a shadow detach from the rocks to their left. They had moments before their position became a tomb. Panic clawed at Maeve's throat, but she forced it down, her mind racing over her father's notes, his geological surveys of this very area. "The echo," she said, her voice a sudden, urgent whisper. "My father wrote about it. The west wall of this spire is unstable, shale, weathered from the inside by water seepage. He said a significant vibration could bring it down." She pointed to a high ledge above the path where the flanking man was advancing. "Up there! It's a rock slide waiting to happen." Kalen's eyes followed her gesture. He saw it instantly. The deep fissures in the rock, the precarious balance of the overhang. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only one they had. "Can you get to the base of that wall?" he asked, his gaze intense. "Yes, if you can keep them busy," she replied, her voice steady now, filled with purpose. "Go," he ordered. As Maeve scrambled from behind the pillar, keeping low and using the deepening twilight as cover, Kalen rose and fired two quick shots, not at the men, but at the rocks just above their heads. The ricochets and spraying stone fragments sent them diving for cover, their attention focused entirely on him. It gave Maeve the precious seconds she needed. She reached the base of the sheer canyon wall, directly below the unstable ledge. Now what? She had no explosives, but her father's journal hadn't mentioned an explosion. It had mentioned vibration, an echo. Meanwhile, Kalen was engaged in a deadly dance. He was a master of this terrain, moving from rock to rock, never presenting a static target, his shots carefully placed to sow confusion and fear. Roscoe, enraged, stormed forward. "He's just one man. Get him!" Below the ledge, Maeve looked desperately around. Her eyes fell upon a narrow cavern-like opening in the rock face near her feet, a feature her father had called a sound chamber. He had written how the unique shape of the rock amplified sound, creating powerful, disorienting echoes. An idea, born of scientific principle and pure desperation, sparked in her mind. She pulled the heavy iron skillet from the pack on her back, a simple piece of camp gear she'd insisted on bringing. Taking a deep breath, she crawled into the opening and began to beat the skillet against the cavern wall with all her might. Clang, clang, clang! The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The sound chamber amplified the metallic impacts 100-fold, turning them into a deafening, thunderous roar that seemed to come from the very bones of the mountain. The sound waves, focused and directed by the shape of the rock, traveled up through the unstable shale. The men below looked up in confusion and terror. The ground began to tremble. Kalen, understanding Maeve's plan, fired a final shot directly into the fissured rock face on the ledge. It was the final push. With a deafening groan, the entire shale overhang gave way. Tons of rock and dust cascaded down into the canyon, not in a massive, sweeping avalanche, but in a focused, deadly torrent that completely blocked the path where Roscoe and his men were advancing. They were cut off, trapped in a choking cloud of dust. But their problems weren't over. As the dust began to settle, a single figure emerged from the chaos near the waterfall. It was Gus. He wasn't running. He was walking toward them, his rifle held at the ready. Roscoe's men were trapped, but he was not, and he was standing between them and the only way out of the canyon. In the ringing silence that followed the rock slide, Kalen pulled Maeve from the sound chamber. The dust was still thick down canyon, obscuring Roscoe's position, but Gus was a clear and present threat. He stood 100 yards away, a silhouette against the fading light. He had a choice to make: flee with what silver he had, or eliminate the only two people who knew his secret. He raised his rifle. He had made his choice. There was no cover between them. It was open ground. "Run!" Kalen yelled, shoving Maeve toward the mouth of the echo passage. He turned to face Gus, raising his own rifle to provide covering fire. He fired, the shot echoing in the sudden quiet. Gus dove behind a boulder, returning fire. A bullet whizzed past Kalen's head, smacking into the rock wall. Maeve hesitated at the entrance to the passage. She couldn't leave him. Her eyes darted around, searching for anything, any advantage. She saw the pack Kalen had dropped when the shooting started. Inside was the large chunk of silver ore they had taken as proof. Another idea, crazier than the last, flashed in her mind. She grabbed the heavy, jagged piece of silver-laced quartz. It weighed at least 20 pounds. "Kalen!" she screamed. He glanced back. She held up the rock, then pointed frantically up the steep canyon wall beside them. He understood instantly. He fired 2 more shots at Gus's position, forcing the blacksmith to keep his head down. While Gus was pinned, Kalen abandoned his rifle and began to climb the sheer rock face, moving with the speed and agility of a mountain goat. Maeve, her heart in her throat, followed him, the heavy oar clutched in one hand, her other hand scrabbling for purchase on the rough stone. Gus, realizing they were escaping up the wall, stepped out from behind his cover and took aim. It was an impossible shot, but just as he was about to squeeze the trigger, a different sound filled the air, the thunder of hooves. A dozen riders from the Stone Crow tribe, alerted by a young boy Kalen had sent as a precaution before they left, poured into the canyon mouth. They had heard the gunfire and come running. Gus stared in disbelief. His moment was gone. He was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. He fired one last angry shot at the climbing figures, then turned and vanished back toward the waterfall in the hidden mine, choosing escape over a fight he could not win. The Stone Crows surrounded the base of the cliff as Kalen and Maeve scrambled the last few feet to the canyon rim. They were safe. They had survived. But as they looked down from the rim, they saw the dust finally settling below, revealing the aftermath of the rockslide. Roscoe and his men were gone, presumably buried, but the silver ore was still in Maeve's hand. They had the proof they needed to bring down Corbin. Their victory, however, felt hollow. Gus was still out there. He knew the mine's location, and now he knew that they knew. And a cornered snake is the most dangerous kind. They had won the battle in the canyon, but they had just kicked off a much larger war. They reached Redemption Gulch just before dawn, 2 exhausted, dust-caked figures slipping through the shadows. They didn't go to their cabin. They didn't go to the Stone Crow camp. They went straight to the telegraph office. The night operator, a sleepy man named Jeb, looked up in alarm as they burst through the door. "We need to send a wire," Maeve said, her voice strained but firm, "to the U.S. Marshal's office in Prescott." She pulled the heavy chunk of ore from her pack and slammed it down on the counter. The metallic thud echoed in the quiet room. "Tell them we have evidence of murder and massive mineral fraud against Bartholomew Corbin." Jeb's eyes widened, first at the rock, then at the look on their faces. He was a town man, but he wasn't one of Corbin's cronies. He knew the difference between right and a paycheck. He nodded and reached for his key. As the message clicked its way across the wires, a sense of finality settled over them. There was no going back. But even as the message went out, Maeve felt a knot of dread in her stomach. "The marshal will take weeks to get here," she said to Kalen as they left the office and melted back into the pre-dawn gloom. "What do we do until then? Corbin will hear about this. He'll know we were in the canyons. He'll know Roscoe is dead. And Gus is a loose end." "We do not hide," Kalen said, his face grim. "Hiding shows fear. We go back to the cabin. We act as we did before. We let Corbin make the next move." It was a dangerous game of nerves. The news of Roscoe's disappearance spread through town like a fever. Corbin put out the story that he and his men had gone after rustlers and hadn't returned. But the townspeople whispered. They'd seen Kalen and Maeve ride out. They'd seen them return, covered in dust. Corbin summoned them to his office the next day. Sheriff Brody was there, his hand resting on his pistol, his face slick with sweat. "My foreman is missing," Corbin said, his small eyes drilling into them. "He was last seen heading toward the Serpent's Tooth. You two wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" "We know nothing of your men," Kalen said, his voice flat. "We were visiting the graves of his ancestors," Maeve added, her voice reverting to its meek, quiet tone. She hunched her shoulders slightly, playing the part. "On the eastern grazing lands, as per your agreement." It was a brilliant lie. It was the one place Corbin had forbidden them to go, the sacred land he'd taken. By claiming they had honored his theft, they threw his accusation back in his face. Corbin's face purpled. He knew they were lying, but he couldn't prove it. He had no body, no witnesses, just suspicion. "Get out," he snarled. As they left, Maeve saw a flicker of movement in the shadows of the alley across the street. It was Gus. He was watching them. He was watching Corbin. He was a ghost, waiting for his moment. The tension in Redemption Gulch stretched taut, ready to snap. Everyone was waiting. Corbin was waiting for proof. Gus was waiting for an opportunity, and Kalen and Maeve were waiting for the law. It was a race, and they were all trapped together in the same small, dusty town, circling each other like scorpions in a bottle. Someone was going to get stung. The next 2 weeks were the longest of their lives. A fragile, ugly truce settled over Redemption Gulch. Kalen and Maeve kept up their public facade of a miserable, mismatched couple. Kalen spent his days with his people, overseeing the newly restored water flow, while Maeve tended to the small cabin, never venturing far. But beneath the surface, the war simmered. Corbin's men watched them constantly, their gazes like physical blows. Every trip to the store, every walk to the creek was scrutinized, and somewhere in the shadows, Gus was a phantom. They would catch glimpses of him, a flicker of movement at dusk, a face in a crowd that would vanish when they looked again. He was waiting, letting Corbin's paranoia do his work for him. The breaking point came in the dead of night. Maeve was awoken by a sound, the soft crunch of a boot on dirt just outside their cabin window. She nudged Kalen awake. He was on his feet in an instant, knife in hand, moving silently to the door. He peered through a crack in the wood. Two of Corbin's men were trying to douse the cabin's walls with kerosene. They weren't just watching anymore. Corbin had decided to end the waiting game. Kalen didn't hesitate. He burst through the door, a whirlwind of motion in the moonlight. The fight was brutal and short. He moved with a warrior's deadly efficiency. When it was over, one man was unconscious and the other was fleeing into the night. But they knew it was only the beginning. "He won't stop," Maeve said, her hands clenched. "He'll send more men. He'll burn the whole town down to get to us." "Then we do not wait for him in a wooden box," Kalen replied. "We choose the battlefield." He looked toward the center of town, toward the one place built of stone and iron. The blacksmith shop, Gus's forge. It was the most defensible building in town, and it was the last place anyone would expect them to go. It was a desperate, crazy gamble. They were walking into the lion's den to escape the wolves. They gathered the journal and the map and slipped out of the cabin, leaving the unconscious man tied up on the floor. They moved through the sleeping town like ghosts, sticking to the alleys and shadows. The blacksmith shop was dark and silent. The big front doors were barred, but Kalen found a small window in the back used for ventilation. He pried it open and slipped inside, then helped Maeve through. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and hot metal. Moonlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating the massive anvil, the quenching tubs, the racks of tools, and the man sleeping on a cot in the corner. Gus sat bolt upright, grabbing for the shotgun he kept by his bed. He stopped when he saw them, his face a mixture of shock and fury. "What are you doing here?" he growled. "Corbin tried to burn us out," Maeve said, her voice ringing with a cold confidence she hadn't known she possessed. "He's coming for us, and when he's done with us, he'll come for you. You're the only other person who knows about the mine." Gus stared at her, his mind working furiously. She was right. He had thought he could play both sides, let Corbin and the Indians destroy each other, and then slip away with the silver. But now all the players were in the same room. "This is my place," he snarled. "Get out." "No," Kalen said, stepping forward. "This is where we make our stand. All of us. You will help us, or you will die with Corbin's men." Before Gus could answer, the sound of shouting erupted from the main street. A torch flared to life, then another. Corbin had discovered their escape. He was coming with an army. The final battle for Redemption Gulch was about to begin. Right here in the heart of the conspiracy. The roar from the street grew louder. It wasn't just Corbin's men, it was a mob. Corbin had told the town that the savage Kalen had murdered Roscoe and was now trying to burn down the town. In their fear, the people believed him. Torches and lamplight painted the walls of the forge in flickering, demonic colors. Gus looked from the approaching mob to Kalen and Maeve. He was trapped. His secret life had collided with his public one. He made his choice. Survival. "The windows are high, but the doors are oak," he grunted, grabbing a heavy hammer. "Help me with the bar." Together, the three of them, the warrior, the scholar, and the thief, barricaded the doors of the blacksmith shop. "Corbin wants a war," Gus growled, checking the load in his shotgun. "Let's give him one." The first wave of men crashed against the doors, their fists and the butts of their rifles thundering against the wood. "Burn them out!" Corbin's voice screeched from the crowd. A flaming torch sailed through one of the high windows, landing on a pile of coal sacks. Kalen quickly smothered it with a heavy leather apron. They were in a fortress of stone and steel, but it was also a tinderbox of wood shavings, coal, and oil. Kalen took up a position near one window, Maeve near another, while Gus guarded the main door. They were outnumbered 20-1. Maeve wasn't a fighter, but she had her father's mind. "The bellows!" she shouted over the noise. "Aim it at the windows!" Kalen and Gus saw her plan instantly. They dragged the massive forged bellows, a huge accordion-like device used to feed air to the fire, and pointed its nozzle toward the window. When the next torch flew in, Kalen pumped the handle with all his strength. A massive gust of air shot out, blowing the torch back out the window and into the faces of the men below. There were screams of pain and surprise. The mob fell back, momentarily confused. The momentary lull was broken by a new sound, a rhythmic metallic clang. Someone was using a sledgehammer on the back wall, trying to break through the stone itself. "That'll be the sheriff," Gus spat. "He's the only one stupid enough to try." They were being attacked on all sides. As Kalen and Gus dealt with the new threat, Maeve looked out at the mob. She saw their faces, the store owner, the stable boy, men she had known her whole life. They weren't evil. They were scared, and Corbin was using their fear. She had to break the spell. She did the last thing anyone expected. She unbarred the small viewing slot in the main door and showed them her face, her scarred, ruined face. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the angry murmur. "Corbin is lying to you. He's the murderer. He killed my father, Patrick O'Connell." The mob went silent. They stared at the girl they had mocked for a decade, now standing defiant in the face of death. "She's crazy," Corbin yelled. "The savage has twisted her mind." "Then ask him," Maeve shot back, pointing a finger directly at the blacksmith shop's owner. "Ask Gus. He was my father's friend. He was there. Ask him who really used the knife that did this to me." She had turned Gus's betrayal into a weapon. Every eye in the crowd swiveled to the blacksmith shop, then to Corbin. They were waiting for an answer. The standoff was broken by the arrival of a cloud of dust and the thunder of hooves. But it wasn't the U.S. Marshals. It was every warrior of the Stone Crow tribe, riding into town with rifles raised, led by the young warrior who had once doubted Kalen. They formed a silent, deadly ring around the blacksmith shop, facing down the mob. The balance of power had just shifted again, and then from the far end of the street, a lone rider appeared. He wore a dusty coat and a badge that glinted in the torchlight. The marshal had arrived. The arrival of Marshal Alistair Finch was like a bucket of cold water on a fire. The mob, caught between the Stone Crow warriors and the unblinking eye of federal law, simply melted away, their anger dissolving into fear and confusion. Corbin's face went pale. His private war had just become a public crime scene. "Marshal, thank God," he blustered, striding forward. "This savage and his witch burned down their cabin and were about to—" "Silence," Finch said, his voice like gravel. He didn't even look at Corbin. His eyes were on the blacksmith shop. "I got a wire about a murder. I'd like to hear about it from the woman who sent it." The heavy bar on the door was lifted. Maeve stepped out into the torchlight, followed by Callan and a grim-faced Gus. She stood before the marshal and the entire town, and with a clear, steady voice, she told them everything. The murder, the map, the lie about the mountain lion. She presented her father's journal, its pages filled with his elegant script and precise drawings. When she was done, a heavy silence hung over the street. Finch turned to Gus. "Is this true? You were his friend." Gus looked at Maeve, then at Corbin. His life of lies had cornered him. He could fall with Corbin, or he could tell the truth and hope for mercy. "It's true," he said, his voice thick. "All of it. I helped Patrick survey. I knew about the silver. After Corbin's man killed him, I was afraid. I kept my mouth shut. It was me who told the sheriff the cougar story. Corbin made me. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough. The final nail in Corbin's coffin was one of his own men, the one who had fled the cabin. Captured by the Stone Crows, he confessed to the arson attempt. implicating his boss. The reckoning came not with a shootout, but with the quiet, inexorable turning of the law. Corbin was arrested, his face a mask of disbelief and impotent rage. As Marshal Finch led him away in chains, his eyes met Kalen and Maeve. He saw them not as a savage and his broken wife, but as the architects of his downfall, their union a symbol of his own arrogant miscalculation. Sheriff Brody was stripped of his badge. Gus, for his role in the cover-up, was also taken into custody. The town, so quick to mock, was now stunned into a fearful silence. The land and the water rights were secured for the Stone Crows. The silver mine, now officially on their land, represented something far greater, a future. It promised schools, medicine, and the ability to negotiate with the changing world on their own terms. Weeks later, Kalen and Maeve stood together on the porch of their rebuilt cabin. They looked out not at the dusty street of the town, but west towards the canyons and the lands of the Stone Crows. The mockery had ceased, replaced by a grudging, bewildered respect. They were still outsiders, but they were no longer outcasts. "My father would have liked you," Maeve said softly, a genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. It transformed her face, softening the scars and revealing a beauty the town had been too blind to see. Kalen looked at her, at this woman of scars and secrets, of intellect and iron will. He had accepted this marriage as a sacrifice, a burden for his people. He now knew it was the greatest gift he had ever received. "He gave his life to uncover a secret in the stone," Kalen replied, his hand finding hers. "You, Maeve, are the treasure he left behind." Their union, forged in mockery and tempered in violence, was now a true partnership, built on a foundation stronger than any rock. Together they would build a new legacy, not of silver and gold, but of justice, survival, and the unexpected strength found when two broken pieces become an unbreakable whole. A story of courage can be found in the most unexpected places. It wasn't Kalen's strength or Maeve's hidden knowledge alone that brought down a tyrant. It was the power they discovered in each other. They took the world's ugliest judgments and turned them into their greatest weapon. Their story reminds us that what we see on the surface is rarely the whole truth. True value, like a vein of precious silver, often lies hidden deep beneath a rough and broken exterior, waiting for someone with the wisdom to look closer. It teaches us that the greatest alliances are often forged not between the perfect and the powerful, but between those who have been cast aside. If you were captivated by the story of Kalen and Maeve's unlikely triumph, please show your support. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed it, and share it with someone who loves a story where the underdog gets their day. Most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We have many more tales from the dusty trails of history to share with you, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thank you for listening.